Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the supplement video for Discipleship Essentials, Lesson 25 on money. You'll notice that this particular lesson is called a bonus lesson. It doesn't fit in the flow of the rest of the lessons from Discipleship Essentials. In the original version of Discipleship Essentials, there were 24 lessons, and Ogden apparently added this one later. I think he could have fitted in a little bit earlier to make it flow a little more smoothly, but I'm glad that he included it. Uh, Money is a super important subject in our lives and in the scripture. And so the fact is that we cannot be faithful disciples apart from how we end up thinking about and handling money. It turns out that Jesus actually talks about money more than he talks about hell. So you can chew on that one for a minute when you think about how important money really is. One of the scripture passages that you'll look at this week actually talks about how money can act as a kind of rival God. And that's certainly true. It's vying for our worship. One of the things he doesn't talk about, though, is how money is symbolic of ourselves. Money represents our time and our effort and our talent, that we spend 40 plus hours a week working for a paycheck. But what we do with that paycheck says a lot about who we are and what we really believe. I want to say, with respect to going through this lesson, that sharing an application on this one are going to be uh, fairly personal. In other words, this is the kind of thing that we don't talk about in polite company, about the size of our paychecks, about how much we give either to the church or to other charitable causes. And so it's going to require great vulnerability. And I think as a group leader, you want to plan accordingly. If your group doesn't know each other very well, then obviously sharing too many details is probably not in the cards. So you shouldn't force people. On the other hand, if your group knows each other really well, if your group's been meeting together for a long time, maybe you should risk it. Maybe people should be willing to say a little bit more about their paycheck, about how they spend it, and then, of course, if you're having people sharing, you need to ensure confidentiality. So those rules often go without saying. In this case, I think you ought to say something to make sure that people understand that anything that gets shared does not get shared outside of the group. A couple of other things as you think about this lesson. One question that came up for me is uh, this whole idea of tithing. Tithing is giving a literal 10%. And the question ends up being, is tithing, in the sense of giving a tenth, a New Testament idea? Is it something that Jesus teaches, or is it symbolic of something? That's a longer discussion, but I think it's worth discussing in your groups, as well as talking about application. Like, what are you going to do about this lesson? This is not a lesson that's just for like your mind somehow. None of them are. But how are you going to live this out? Finally, by way of introduction on the lesson, let me talk about one thing that Ogden does not say with respect to money. Uh, he kind of falls into that familiar pattern that Christians fall into when they talk about money. They think of only a few things that you can do with money. You can spend it, often on yourself, and that's supposed to be bad. And then you can save it. Saving is a good thing, or you can give it, and giving is a good thing. And those are like the only options. And I just want to say that Luke 16, 1 through about 8 or 9, right up in there, gives us another picture from the mouth of Jesus about something that we could do faithfully with money. I won't ruin the surprise if your group wants to study Luke chapter 16 as a kind of bonus study after this lesson. I think that would be marvelous because Jesus talks about a way to use money that not very many of us think about. So at least we don't think about it from a Christian point of view. Okay, let's talk about the content of this lesson as it's written. Ogden says, what attitude and practice should disciples have regarding money? Disciples live with a healthy fear of the money god, mammon, knowing that it has the power to command devotion. A way to put limits on our greed and to laugh in the face of mammon is to begin our practice of giving with a minimum of a tithe or a tenth of our resources to the Lord's work. So, keywords and phrases here. I picked out healthy fear. I think of this less as actual fear and more like a healthy respect. We have to treat money as powerful, but dangerous. Money is not a neutral thing, and that's one of the things that comes out of that Matthew 6 study, is that money isn't just a neutral thing. Money will try to woo us. Money will try to seduce us. And so it kind of has a little bit of, if not a negative sort of power to it, certainly a dangerous power. It's not neutral. Secondly, power to command devotion. This is the thing that we're talking about, that money often becomes a rival to God. Well, how does it do this? I think it does it by making many of the same promises that God makes. So, God promises us freedom, he promises security, he promises power, and he promises pleasure. And these are the things that money promises as well. Money says that if we have enough of it, that we'll be free. We'll be able to we'll have the power to do whatever we want. And we'll be safe if we have enough money. And money is the gateway to pleasure. These are the things that God promises, and it's why that we often think that money is the key to the good life, because it is promising us the same things that God promises. It becomes a kind of false God. Ogden here talks about a minimum of a tithe. A tithe is 10%, it's a tenth, and he thinks of a tenth as a starting place for giving. I actually think it's a good practical starting place for giving myself. The question that I have is whether that is something that is still being taught in the New Testament. And then finally, the gift of our giving is supposed to be given to the Lord's work. I don't think that necessarily means to the church, although I think it sometimes does, or to missionaries. But it is dedicated to the Lord and to the purposes of the Lord. Is your giving to the poor, does that count as part of your tithe? Well, different teachers have different opinions on that. I would say that it does count. But anyway, lots of questions that you could go into there. With the memory verse guide, this is a classic passage from Matthew chapter 6. I think the strength of this passage is in that memory verse. This idea that no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And I think in America, our desire is to do exactly that. We would love to be able to serve both God and money. And Jesus is saying that simply isn't possible. We either end up being loyal to one and kind of turning on the other, or vice versa. So think about that in your own life. I think the strength of this reflection is not in that idea. The idea is fairly simple. It's talking about our own lives. It's talking about who do we serve, really. And that is a significant kind of conversation if we can be honest about it. Does money have power over us? I would have to say that in my life, I think money does have power over my life, although it's not the power that I often see out in the world. I'm not trying to collect as much of it as is humanly possible. I'm not one who's given to having lots of expensive things. However, I find that it's very hard for me to give generously beyond a certain point. I often give generously and gladly, and then I can feel it kind of creeping up on me because I think I sometimes entertain a spirit of scarcity, of poverty. And so I think that I survive by my own cleverness with money. I just don't spend a lot of it. I can live on little. And that's not what God is after here. God is not trying to get us to live on little. God is trying to get us to trust him. and to see that the key to life is in trusting him and in knowing him, and not in how much money we have, whether we have tons and tons of it and we spend it all on ourselves, or whether we hoard a little bit that we have and try to stretch it as far as we can with our own cleverness. The inductive Bible study section of this lesson is kind of interesting. I don't think of it as terribly inductive. He pulls out 3 passages to try to make certain points about money. So I don't think of that as inductive. At the same time, the 3 passages are super interesting and definitely worth a Bible study in your groups. Again, as we've been doing, I would pick either the memory verse guide or the inductive Bible study guide, depending on what's good for your group. But I think this inductive Bible study guide can be super interesting. The Leviticus 27 passage just talks about the tithe and what it encompasses, which is basically everything about our lives. And secondly, there's the Deuteronomy 14 passage, which I think surprises a lot of Christians, because it says that part of the tithe can be spent on this gigantic blowout party where you can buy, the best food and wine. And, if you're a drinking kind of person, hard liquor, which, I don't drink at all. So it's a kind of a shock to my system. But the question of why would part of your tithe be spent on a huge party, on an extravagant vacation or on a big, gigantic worship party? Why is that? And again, I think it illustrates for me that the purpose of giving and the purpose of the tithe is not to deprive us. It is to teach us about God, that God is generous and that we put our trust in him. If you took 1/10 of your annual income and blew it on one gigantic party, that is an act of faith. It shows that we are trusting that God is going to still provide for us, even when we have this gigantic banquet dedicated to worshiping him. Now, that's not the only thing that the tithe is for, and he talks about a tithe that goes to Christian workers, or workers of God, and then to the poor and the vulnerable. I think our tithe is to be given to all of these things. And then Malachi 3 is the famous passage that talks about not robbing God, but testing him by giving the tithe and seeing that God will provide. And I actually think that one of the more interesting applications that could come out of this lesson is the question of whether or not we are willing to take God at his word, to step into it and allow God to show us that he will provide for us when we give generously. So you can think about that as a group. The reading study guide, I didn't think had anything that was too extraordinary. Fairly straightforward. Read the essay, answer the questions. I think the thing that makes this work in the lesson, if you're willing to do it, is to share personally out of your lives. Again, I understand sharing about money, it's kind of a private area of our lives, and it can be embarrassing. And, if we've got more, we can embarrass the person who has less, or if we have more, people may look at us different and call us to account on some things, and we don't want that. I understand that there are problems, but I think that if we are going to be faithful disciples of Jesus, we have to learn to be honest about money and accountable to our brothers and sisters. So you can make of that what you will, but I think it's super important, if not in your discipleship group, then with some small grouping of Christians that who you feel okay to share about your personal finances with and are willing to allow them to hold you accountable. Well, this is the end of Discipleship Essentials for this time through. My hope is that it won't die here. Don't let it stop here. Pass it on in a group of new people that haven't been through this yet, to be willing not just to pass on information, but to share all that God has entrusted to you. You are a disciple maker. You are if you're faithful. And I want you to be faithful, to not let faith end with you, but to make it into the next generation. God bless you as you follow Jesus and continue in your discipleship journey.